All right, welcome to, and of course I immediately forget the actual title of the panel, but it's like we're discussing contemporary Gothic here in one way or another. Thank you for joining us this late at night. We are all prepared to be incredibly spooky as best we can. My name is Caitlin Starling. I am the author of The Luminous Dead, as well as a Vampire the Masquerade novella that came out this summer, a novella that comes out in a couple of weeks called Yellow Jessamine, and eventually next year a Gothic novel of my own titled The Death of Jane Lawrence.
Hello, I'm Jeanette. My one published novel, Under the Pendulum Sun, is apparently a pile of Gothic trash in the best possible way. Or maybe a bad way, uncertain, but it exists. I have also recently won a Campbell for saying words at people.
I'm Jordan Corella. I'm Jordan Corella. I am actually a goth, but I don't write Gothic fiction. I just write to read it because that's what you do. I have a number of short stories out in like Apex and Strange Horizons and Beneath Useless Skies. They're all pretty dark and creepy. I also have a story coming out that's also dark and creepy next month with Glitter and Ashes and the Anna Hemlock Thing, and a dark and creepy apocalyptic carrion bird story in Zooscape next month. So.
And hi, I'm Mari Ness. I have also a number of short stories out, including one that kind of rather directly addresses the topic of this panel. It's called The Girl and the House, and it is a Gothic story. Appeared in Nightmare last year, very much about the girl and the house. And I also have stories in Clark's World Tour, Uncanny, a lot. We'll share social media things later if people are interested. And with that, I kind of want to jump right into the panel idea and how I came up with it, what we were going to do with it, and get us launched. So basically, this summer, since I was trapped at home, I read two other books, Gothic, whatever. One was Mexican Gothic, and the other was by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, and the other was The Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware. And I was struck by Mexican Gothic. Yes, I was expecting a Gothic novel. The Turn of the Key, I was not. And I was struck by how much both of them had a lot to say about the earlier Gothic works, particularly in the 1950s, 1960s, really through the 1980s. If you haven't encountered these books, they, for the most part, looked back into the 19th century. They tend to be set as 19th century books, and they're kind of like, what if we'll do Jane Eyre, but we'll do it a little bit differently. And they typically involve a house and a girl. There are variations on the subject, but that is usually the issue. The house is haunted, the house has secrets, the girl has to discover them. And very often there is some sort of light romance involved, which I also want to get into in a bit. This was very much popularized by Victoria Holt, was probably the best known of these authors. And that is the author that I think Mexican Gothic is very much in extreme conflict and discussion with. Had a lot to say about that, but also some other writers, Phyllis Whitney. Many of you probably have read Barbara Michaels and Elizabeth Peters. Mary Stewart is
Stewart as well.
Mary Stewart
as well.
Yeah, she's usually placed in this genre. I have a little bit of a problem with placing her in that genre because most of her books are not, but she's often considered a Gothic novelist, even though really only 3 or 4 of her books at most really fit that theme. But you can jump in.
I've been reading Paperbacks from Hell, so I really want to. I'm sorry. I really want to interject this amazing quote. So basically, the kind of origin story of the Gothic novel apparently came from one of the editors noticing his mother reading Rebecca, and then he's like, "Why are you reading that book, like published in the 30s?" And this was in the 1959, and she was like, "Oh, darling, they don't write them like this anymore." And he's like, "Oh, okay." And then basically, apparently, he bought the rights for a lot of the earlier Gothic novels in bulk, republished them, and that kind of spurred on the Gothic romance revival. And my favorite part of this story is this quote, where he says, a memo to his art director about the covers. I want a category format that my mother and aunts would be proud to be seen reading. Make the heroine look like a very refined, upper-class, blonde, young woman with good cheekbones. She's running towards you. Beside her is a dark castle with one light in the window, usually in the tower. Make the tower dark, phallic, thick. Believe me, they'll get it. And it's like, it's the bit about the phallic tower that,
and what's wonderful about this, I love that quote. Thank you so much for bringing it to me, because one of the things when I was doing a bit more research for this panel that really struck me is these books tended to be shelved in romantic suspense or as romance novels. And many of them are really light on romance. Yes, there is a romance. It shows up at the tail end, but it's not really there. And yet here we have this cover that's going to focus on the phallic symbols and the girl, everything. And just saying, yes, there's going to be more romance here than you would actually find in the book.
I found an interesting point on that, or something I want to bring up, which is back when I was in the early stages of writing The Death of Jane Lawrence, it wasn't working and I didn't know why. And I happened to meet Jeanette. And Jeanette was wonderful and was like, okay, so what is your character desire? Because the book is about the character's desires, not necessarily sexual, but it could be, not necessarily, traditional, definitely not traditional desires. You don't want a traditional desire. It's got to be torrid and it's got to be intense, but it can be really kind of sideways. Not about a man or a woman or just any other person even. It can be about power. It's a little bit rarer, I think, but that's the kind of avenue I think a lot of modern stuff is going towards, is that allure of power. But what else? How does desire function in the Gothic?
And you do see that in those 1950s through 1980s books where the women usually have less of a power in the sense of having any money. Oddly, Victoria Holt pushed back on this by making most of her heroines which is interesting in the context in which he's writing, but most of them are depicted as comparatively powerless. And there's a lot about, oh yes, let's all remember the woman had no power in the 19th century. That's one of the things I'm seeing contemporary Gothic books fight back on, because in Mexican Gothic, this is the protagonist comes from a well-to-do family. She has power. This is not the person that is left alone in the world without any relatives, without, the typical idea of that, older Gothic novel where, oh, she doesn't have the power. She does. How do we take it away from her? And what does she do with that power? Mm-hmm. And for me, a really fascinating, okay, here's a different approach, along with Mexican Gothic saying, and by the way, these stories did not all happen to just white women. Because many of those books had a lot of incidences of, white girl goes off to exotic place where she is very much the outsider. But very often this will happen in a foreign country with some unfortunate readings and consequences that do not play out as well.
Well, as Northanger Abbey puts it, you can't have the Gothic in England. Like, you can't have the Gothic at home.
Mm-hmm.
These things just don't happen here. They have to happen in the continent. And mix up, depending who the writer and audience is. You have to swap these out.
They do that with
conscious other space.
The book Things in Jars by Jess Kidd involves a woman who is powerful, but she's powerful in her own way. She's it's Victorian, it's Gothic, but it combines a woman who has apparently, I can't get into the spoilers, but she has stolen power in a way from like being mysteriously widowed. Like, how did that happen? And like, she wears a widow's cap, but is it real? Nobody knows, where did her husband go into mysterious circumstances? But she's a disgraced private eye. And she's hired because she's just a disgraced private eye, because there's no way she's going to find this child who isn't actually a child, because that's where the cosmic horror comes in. But it's cosmic horror in that way of there are things in the sea, Bob, and they don't belong there, sort of thing. So it's it's that kind of combination of it is in England. It's set in London, and then in the countryside of London. In the countryside of London, what am I talking about? I'm just talking too fast. In the countryside of England, and then that with her powerful, disgraced power and her disgraced widowhood, mysterious widowhood, she then goes and has to then reclaim that power back. So it's an amazing book full of what is going on. It's half Gothic, half cosmic horror.
We have a comment from the chat that I'm just going to quickly address. Is the book in question is actually titled Mexican Gothic
Yes.
by Sylvia Moreno Garcia.
Yes.
I personally do not know of other examples of Mexican origin Gothic stories, but I bet Sylvia does.
I see the thing in the Discord, Things in the Sea, Cthulhu, cosmic horror. Yes, it's kind of based on Cthulhu mythos. Yes, a little bit. Yes. But Mexican Gothic is the
Cosmic horror is the way you say Lovecraftian without saying Lovecraftian.
Yes, that is how.
It's not referring to that particular guy. Yeah.
Brutally.
Yeah.
We're gonna keep saying it until it sticks. I'm sorry.
Mhm.
So how about we, since we started talking a little bit about it, let's talk about setting as character, because that seems to be a very, very important element of Gothic fiction, where yes, there's your protagonist. Yes, there's the people who live in the house or have lived in the house, who have all these secrets, but the setting itself, usually the house, sometimes not, seems to be its own character with its own, almost its own goals, or at least its own effect on the people who live in it. I'm going to do a slight quick diversion to talk about myself. But so The Luminous Dead, I did not write intending as a Gothic novel, but some very intelligent people have read it and gone, did you know you wrote a Gothic novel? In that case, it's set in a cave, but it's a cave full of secrets. And it is, as we before the show, we were talking about how there's often an element of going into the basement or into the cellar. Well, it's all down in a cave. And sort of, so in that case, the cave became a very obvious thing. I actually had to think about it, because it wasn't just, oh, I'm going to phone this in and put it in a house. So it made me really aware of the power of setting as character. What are some other, in Jeanette's book, Under the Pendulum Sun, Fairyland alone is its own character, and then you get the house itself. Yeah. Which just
other things that are setting as character. There's I think me personally, when I write things, the setting has to be a character. If the setting is not a character, then the whole thing falls apart. And that just has to do with what the kind of fiction I like to read, the kind of movies I like to watch, the kind of TV shows I like, the media I consume. The setting has to be a character. And I think that comes from my love of Gothic fiction growing up. Rebecca is one of my favorite. It's my favorite Hitchcock movie. So of course I read Rebecca the book, and then I loved anything Gothic after that. So because they just don't write them that way anymore. So to call back. But if the setting isn't, the setting is basically, that's the foundation, just to get into house analogies. The setting is the foundation of an entire novel. So you do setting that the house, fairyland, caves, like the thing with a house though, when you do a setting as a Gothic, there has to be a place where you can't go. Right? So there has to be a wing or a basement or a room or a thing. And because the house itself
Mad Woman in the Attic.
Yeah, a Mad Woman in the Attic. So so basically it's a closed off space. It's a whole entire place where you can't go, or like a mist that you can't go through because it'll make you see things or make you get lost, and then you can't find your way back, to refer to your book, Jeanette. So you go under the water and then you get lost and you find a corpse that makes you hallucinate. So so I'm just bringing up other people's books. So you have to create situations in these closed spaces that also make you turn back or create questions of what the protagonist or the main character is doing there, that make them explore further. Otherwise, the setting itself is static.
And I think that's why you often get into situations of the protagonist is either by current circumstance or by the path their life has taken, is currently poor, is disadvantaged in some way, is lower class, is sometimes in a marriage of convenience that seems like it'll solve all their problems, perhaps. And it gets into that, what about this character's circumstances have given them no other option than to do what they are currently doing.
I was actually going
So-
to go back a little bit more on the house thing and bring up two other quick examples. One is with the Turn of the Key, one of the books that kind of inspired this panel. The house is a smart house. Everything in it is something that either Bill Gates already has or probably will be selling to us in the future. And that gives the house a personality, and it changes the plot of the book because they know the house is watching. It's a smart house. It knows exactly what's going on. So there is a significant amount of interaction between all of the technology and the characters, and how that is influencing the characters, how it is changing them. And it's an amazing book, by the way. It really, really is good. The other alternative setting I've seen is, and this tends to be more romantic suspense, Susanna Kearsley does this with time travel and history. That's her house. The main character, whoever is in the contemporary period, needs for some reason to discover something about the past. In some cases, one of her books, the character is actually able to slip into the past, see past things. But what we've been talking here about, there's a part of the castle, the house, that's closed off, which certainly happens in the Turn of the Key, but it also happens in this time traveling period. There's parts of the past she can't see. And until she can see those bits, she can't solve the puzzle, the murder, get to where she's going to go. And now I've forgotten the later question that you just asked. So I'm sorry, I went backwards and then kept this from going forwards as much. So,
Jeanette, you were going to say something.
Can I interject about the so in terms of houses or even the setting itself, I think there are a couple of things that they can stand for, because to me it's very much about an externalization of it's sort of environment design as storytelling, basically. So it is a character, but it's also just, so is the protagonist, through exploring the space, exploring inwards? Are they exploring themselves? Like, as they open doors, are they opening doors into insights into their secret desires? Mm-hmm. Other option, and sometimes happening at the same time, is the house is an extension of the villain who owns it, the Byronic hero, sometimes the beast. And through learning the house, the heroine, because it's always kind of that, because that's the way it goes, that kind of crazy gender binary, kind of learns more about both herself or themselves and the person who owns the house. So it acts as this medium where interacting through the house interacts between the two characters. Or it could be a broader statement where, the house is the sort of the accreted history of, or even a microcosm of a larger historical kind of the crimes of history, the sort of, post-colonial Gothic does this especially, where you kind of have the history and all the bad things that people in power have done. You see evidence of it in the house, and you're exploring it. It is exploring that history. So you're exploring the house physically, but you're also exploring kind of emotionally and from a narrative point of view, uncovering these spaces. There's actually an amusing roleplay game. I think it's called something like The Brides of
Bluebeard's Bride. Bluebeard. I was about to bring that up. Yeah.
Which kind of has the exploring the house as exploring parts of the self as an very explicit mechanic in that game, which is quite clever. And I always like bringing up in terms of like unusual settings is sort of something like Gideon the Ninth, which is kind of Gothic, where kind of the ways it makes it very Gothic is kind of taking the kind of grandiosity, the hugeness of space, and kind of putting that into and then mashing that up with kind of the Gothic. So you have these ruins, they're big, they're sublime, they're ancient, and space is big and huge and ancient and incomprehensible, and kind of those two kind of mash up very nicely, arguably with a side helping of cosmic horror.
Bluebeard's Bride, for those of you who have not played it, it is a very cool game. It as well has a lot of setting shifts to it, has a lot of additional things, so you can change the original setting to something else, including like being at boarding school. There's a variant for all male characters, which is interesting. Getting into that gender, the morbid gender nature of Gothic that's often there. But the primary mechanic is that all of the players at the table are the protagonist, the one protagonist. They are different aspects of the protagonist's mind and psyche and personality, and as they take turns exploring the house and choosing where the protagonist will go, that will exaggerate certain elements of their personality, and shut down other parts, potentially to the detriment of the group as a whole. So definitely check that out if you have not played it. It is very cool, and the art is very pretty.
It's quite a clever way to mechanize a lot of these dynamics within Gothic.
I was thinking after what you said about the whole like structure of the house and the person who owns the house as the potential villain, or the basically the setting, the antagonist villain versus the protagonist. Basically, you have the structure. And I'm just going to use house. The condition of the house can be a character condition. So shoddy construction, shoddy foundation, shoddy this, shoddy that, can speak to the state of the villain or the protagonist based on whoever you want the setting to then mirror. So, and also the desires that Caitlin was talking about, the desires for power can speak to how swiftly or how quickly the person goes to the house and all that kind of stuff. So like, this is just like me thinking about like when you're reading, how you can like basically dissect the entire book, which is my favorite thing to do. Or if you're wanting to write a Gothic thing, basically go through and just basically think that way. So I don't know. I like to dissect everything as I read because it's kind of like science, except with books.
Can we talk real quickly about the types of secrets that tend to be embedded in these houses? You know, what are our protagonists uncovering? A lot of times, to me, it seems that they have to do with feelings of shame. But I am not as well read as many of you. So I would really like to hear your take on it.
Murder was always the traditional one, where there is a skeleton someplace, we can't find it, we never talk about that particular person. That was really strong in the 1960s, 1970s. It was something that Barbara Michaels really ran with. And it's still continuing with some of, now that we're in what I would call another revival. You see Carol Goodman definitely working with in the past. And Mexican Gothic certainly has a lot to do with secrets of that nature. But I find that with the Gothics I'm seeing now, the secrets are in some ways more, this is going to sound odd because, you know, murder is obviously a bad thing. But the secrets that we're now seeing tend to be somewhat more scandalous or somewhat more personal. And they also tend to hint at a lot more ongoing abuse, not just a last murder. So there is a shift there that I'm seeing, but definitely you usually have to find out whatever secret the house is concealed or whatever secret the other characters have concealed. And very often it is other characters
you think are dead. Characters introduced as dead but secretly alive somewhere in the house is kind of classic.
Yeah, the malleable nature of death. It's not exactly permanent in Gothic fiction in either direction.
I was thinking The Maid, which is an Asian horror movie. It's about a maid from the Philippines. If you don't know, it's very common for overseas domestic servants as part of East Asian. It's how East Asia rolls these days. And women from the Philippines very often work in other parts of East Asia, like Singapore or and I can't remember which East Asian place, but like, and where they don't speak the language, where it's very different, where it's a very different culture, and they're very different religion, and they're kind of have to kind of cope, and they're usually very young women, and they're in a position of very little power. There's a lot of abuse. It's all kind of it's all very terrible, very real thing. And The Maid kind of draws in that and makes it into a Gothic film out of it, where we follow this young woman. She's Catholic. She doesn't really speak is it Hokkien that they speak? I can't remember the dialect of Chinese that they speak in the film. And the house is full of puppets because it's they're like a Chinese opera puppet troupe, and they're told that it's just the start of Ghost Festival, which, by the way, it's Ghost Festival right now. It's Ghost Month. The doors of the dead are open, etc. Good time to have a Gothic panel. And they have a dead son who turns out, plot twist, not dead. It's a great movie. It's very atmospheric, and it very much kind of shakes up who gets to be the Gothic heroine and sort of like but it very much has the things with the rules, the house, the secrets, and the creepy atmosphere and what is going on, because they keep telling her about all these taboos that she keeps accidentally breaking. And again, it's another very Gothic thing. But yeah, secrets. Dead people, not dead.
Do we also want to talk about Parasite as Gothic?
Parasite, you were talking about that one is a horror Gothic movie because there's the house and there's the secrets, but you brought it up, so let's let you talk about it. Yeah. I don't know who I'm pointing at because the one might be all over the place. So yeah. So
I actually still have not watched it, although I have been fully spoiled. We probably should avoid full spoilers, but again, I'm just throwing it out. It came up a little bit in our pre-show discussion, so I thought it might be a nice segue.
So sorry, I just got excited.
It's a really interesting example of being almost, it's kind of the question, kind of leaping ahead of like how many rules you can break before it stops looking like the Gothic, because it very much has the House of Secrets feel and the use of space and to convey secrets and characters and the places you can't go, and all the various kind of tics of the family kind of getting worse and worse, and that character study aspect it does, now that I think about it, feel very Gothic. But certainly at the time, it didn't strike me as such. No women in nightgowns.
There's that Gothic aspect to it that you can that you can twist and meld, because there's a place where you can't go, and there's someone who knows everything about the house, and something happens to that someone, and revenge, and so like, and I don't want to spoil it, because it's one of those things that if you spoil one thing, the whole thing just unravels. So it's a brilliant piece of, it's one of those movies that I watched and then watched it again immediately, like a week later, just to pick up on what I missed. So, but the house itself is such a character that if you took it away, the whole film would fall apart. And that's the whole thing about setting as character. And then, because the secrets are embedded in the setting and the characters are embedded in the setting, but if you took these settings away from these Gothic places, the whole book, the whole movie falls apart. Yeah.
So how much can you change before it's not Gothic anymore?
I want to talk about...
And there's a difference between recognizably Gothic and not fundamentally not Gothic, I think, because as we were saying, Parasite, if you actually go down and check the boxes, it qualifies, but watching it, the atmosphere doesn't immediately sort of like suggest that it's Gothic. But how much can you change? We also talked a little bit before the show about Jurassic Park: Fallen World.
Fallen Kingdom. So
Fallen Kingdom.
It's a ridiculous idea, but it's technically Gothic because they take the dinosaurs to a large mansion. They put them in the basement. They have to rescue them. It's ridiculous. There's all these secrets. They reveal the secrets in the movie. So it's technically not. But the thing is that it's all this kind of like, what's going to happen? But it's a ridiculous response to Jurassic World, because they revealed all the ridiculousness in Jurassic World during the movie. And then they said, okay, fine, you don't want that kind of movie. We're just going to give you this kind of movie. So, and it's technically Gothic because there's a mansion, there's secrets, there's monsters in the basement, which is a secret. But it's not. But if you look at it, it ticks about maybe 90% of the boxes. But if you said to someone, Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom is a Gothic movie, they'd say, get out of my house. But yeah.
Some of it has
So
to do with if you're saying Gothic versus non-Gothic, and I was kind of thinking this in the sense of both Mary Stuart and Jurassic Park. In the pre-discussion, we were mentioning Mary Stuart as one of the Gothic novelists who's fairly well known, with the slight issue that most of her books are not actually Gothic. And I would say, how are they not Gothic? Well, they involve a British tourist. This is not a girl needing a job. This is not sometimes she ends up at a sort of interesting mansion or whatever, but like one of her more famous books, because Disney turned it into a very bad movie. There's no house. She's wandering around in Greece. Everybody's fine. There's a little of excitement. This is the Moon Spinners. So if you don't have that house, or if you don't have the same sort of dynamic, like most of the Mary Stuart protagonists don't consider themselves to be anything other than normal. They don't feel cut off from society. They don't, which is very typical of many Gothic protagonists. They're not searching for themselves. So in those senses, if you leave that essential character out, I think you've somewhat left Gothic. Also, if you have a very realistic setting where no one ever thinks, hey, that really could be a ghost, even if that ghost turns out not to be a ghost, which is why I would say the Jurassic World fits much better into the Gothic than some of the Mary Stuart books, just because, hey, the dinosaurs are not normal. They are monsters. That is an actual monster going around. Whereas in books that got shelved as Gothic, because their author happened to write a Gothic novel or two back in the day, are probably not. And I'm going to sideline just a little bit and note that this has typically happened more with women writers than with male writers or men. Like Henry James does not get, constantly stalked in Gothic and romantic suspense. He wrote a Gothic book, very Gothic, but the rest of his books are accepted. No, they're not Gothic, but can stay in the literary side. And yes, there are Gothic books that do end up not shelved in Rome, shelved in more mainstream or now we're seeing them shelved in genre or horror. But there tends to be a categorizing certain writers in, oh yes, this person only does this, when it's just that one book, which is not something that happens as often to someone like Henry James. The one author who did do a Gothic book who escaped this would be Joyce Carol Oates. I hated her Gothic book, but she did write one. But she's never been characterized as a Gothic novelist. And very often when you say, did you know that Joyce Carol Oates wrote a Gothic novel? They're like, what, really? Yeah, she did back in the 80s. I think it's Blithwood, I believe is the name of the title.
I think what's like, to me, like when you said like the categorization of Gothic and not Gothic, what strikes me as interesting is V.C. Andrews. Especially when one contrasts the V.C. Andrews books that she actually wrote and the ghostwritten ones that are still being published now. Like right now, they're still going. And because I am personally, whilst the ghostwriter is perfectly competent, I don't think they quite get to the Gothic in the same way as V.C. Andrews did. Mm-hmm. So where I'm reading the kind of the ghostwritten ones where I'm like, yeah, this on paper has all the beats of a Gothic. But unlike say, because it echoes a lot of the plot beats of, say, I don't know, Flowers in the Attic, like a lot of the classic V.C. Andrews Gothic stuff, but it doesn't have the beats don't fall in the right place. So the main character is, she's powerless, she's vulnerable, blah, blah, blah. She goes to this big hotel and it's very grandiose. And the writer, he doesn't have, he's not attuned to, in my mind, to the Gothic enough to use that house as an extension of character, despite the fact, if indeed they are correct, that he's getting all this from V.C. Andrews' notes and outlines, it's all there. on paper. Like it's I was like, yes, this family has secrets. They have all the scandal, and it's all there, but it's not, because the characters aren't discovering it through the house. They don't feel the same sense of torrid forbiddenness and attraction that a V.C. Andrews heroine would, and like it just doesn't feel right. And I find that distinction very interesting, because it's not the plot, it's the feel of it.
Those atmosphere, then, can we agree, is very important for something to be Gothic? Not just so it feels Gothic, but to make it actually be Gothic, it has to have this sort that, like you said, this torridness, this that atmospheric, this tonal focus that doesn't really relent. I mean, really, are there any, like, I can't think of any instances, there probably are some, but where there's like a comedic interlude where they all go to the beach? That doesn't really happen. You can't really leave the setting very much in a Gothic story.
They do in Elizabeth Peters' books, but she was mocking the entire genre. So in an Elizabeth Peters book, yes, they will, and they'll make fun of the ghost, and it's a lot of fun. The ones where she's really mocking hard time on the Gothic, and she has when she has a suit of armor start walking around and clanking noises, and they poke fun at that. And there is a great Elizabeth Peters where she ends the book saying, "Yeah, I'm not getting married to either one of you." That's what a Gothic character. They've been spending the entire book they're at a castle. There's a ghost. There's walking suits of armor. It is just the atmosphere is dripping, and they spend most of their time insulting each other. And then at the end, she's like, "Yeah, I'm not getting married to you guys. I'm going to get my job. I have my dream job at a museum. That's what I'm going off to do." And it's great. So if you count Elizabeth Peters as Gothic, and she certainly knew what she was doing, yeah, you do have some Gothics where people go and have fun in the middle of the book, but it's rare. That seems to have been mostly her.
Or Northanger Abbey, for that matter. They do like hang out in Bath for a good chunk of Northanger Abbey.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't like. I'm ambivalent about it being like Gothic.
There's a bit in there's I mean, Bone Weaver's Orchard has a small child who goes to a boarding school, and he has a whole bunch of bugs, which is my favorite bit of the book, but because there's bugs. But he goes and he has a friend for a hot minute, and I'm not going to give spoilers, but that's a great bit of the book where he goes and hangs out with his buddy, and it's fun and it's great. And then, it's a horror novel, so it's a very spooky boarding school. And the bugs are actually the good bit. So that's not the scary part. But it's a Gothic novel in the fact that there's a lot of like really heartwarming bits with the best friend. So that are just like out in the leaves with the apples. So yeah, and I think you need that in a Gothic novel to basically, and I talk about this as humor in writing dark fiction a lot, is that you need a little bit of like, okay, we can breathe for a second, and before you dive back into like here's the depths of the depravity of the story. So so because you need to give people a break before their minds break. Yeah. So I don't know.
I'm sitting here going, I don't think I gave anyone a break in the Luminous Dead. I think that kind of just. For those of you who have not read it, the main character is literally stuck in a suit the entire time, like the most terrifying form of PPE and social distancing you've ever encountered, and they're alone in a cave. There are no beach episodes.
But there was a lot of climbing that you got to read.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there was action adventure as your palate cleanser.
Yeah,
we are about 12 minutes out from the end of this panel. Do we want to do sort of kind of final thoughts and then focus on audience questions?
I've been seeing some of the audience questions coming up, and I've answered a few of them. Okay. I don't think I've done particularly thorough answers on any of them because I don't know some of the books that are getting mentioned. Like Mystery at Lilac Inn, I have not read that, so I have no idea if that's Gothic or not. So really answer your question once again. I'm doing a terrible job of answering Caitlin's questions. I feel awful.
Sorry.
So you ask a question and I go off. That. But,
yeah, and Radcliffe's novels do. I think Anne Radcliffe's novels have the thing because it's partly that sense of original recipe Gothic novels kind of are born, as they say, out of so the Romantics were very into the ruins and the kind of idea of the sublime, that like looking at ruins, looking at old things, looking at big things makes you a better person. It makes you write poetry and it makes you a better person. And then the Gothic response to it was kind of like, no, actually, maybe looking at ruins all the time and living with the weight of the past, maybe that makes you an insane person. But in a good way, maybe, but also not. So like I feel like Anne Radcliffe is very much at that point where it's kind of tackling with the does living amongst ruins and scenery and looking at all these big things that make you feel feelings, like, is it good or bad? And it's and Anne Radcliffe was right into the idea that of terror versus horror, the idea, and she defined it as terror as this feeling of fear, but it's expansive. It makes you feel bigger. It makes you feel more. And it's invigorating. And horror, like versus horror, which is just it's just everything is horrible, and you want to curl up, and then it's terrible, and it's that these two different types of fear. And I think over the many decades of people writing the Gothic versus horror, in some ways, people have come up with different definitions of this. But I think we come back to this concept where fear as this expansive, stimulating, bringing out the true self, exploring the self kind of aspects versus the horror is just horrible. It's just monsters. It's scary. I don't like it. Kind of the revulsion side, the visceral revulsion versus the kind of thing that you're scared of but you want to run towards. And these are the kind of two cornerstones, and I think the Gothic kind of draws much more on this side than that side. But I kind of, it was one of the middle questions that we kind of skipped over that I kind of wanted to end on talking, which is like the doubting your senses, the sort of the psychological horror, if you will, of Gothic, because it was an aspect of Pendulum Sun that I was very keen on, which is playing with the main character's mind, which, spoilers, she spends a lot of time thinking she might be a changeling, and the way and how she could tell is she's a changeling is, for example, she doesn't have a lot of early memories. Before then she was like 6 or so. She's everything's kind of like a blur to her. So clearly that means she was swapped because she doesn't have real memories of her childhood, and things like that. Or lactose intolerance turns out to be a clue that you might be a changeling because the milk kind of rots inside your stomach and stuff like that. So it's this idea that I was very keen on, which is that all the things that she thinks make her inhuman are actually fundamentally very human. and that was, I don't know, I was very drawn to that idea of, like, at least for me, I was really into that because that was a thing that I was like, that was very related to my own mental health issues, where I kept going, yes, this thing is terrible, I need to get rid of it. And it's like, but maybe that's the thing that is a human trait. And I'm referencing a terrible meme, and it's completely relevant.
Oh, the butterfly. Is this a human trait? I've done something. So with the Death of Jane Lawrence, which I'm just finishing up copy edits on right now. This was when I started writing the book. I did not realize that I was writing the protagonist to be an autistic woman, like I myself am. But during the edits, it really came out. And in terms of how she sees herself as set apart from the world, but also fundamentally doesn't trust how other people perceive the world, because it doesn't match how she's perceiving it. She's always perceived the world this way. And then when she runs up against the there's a lot of sleep deprivation and other things that cause some uncertainty about if she's perceiving real things, if she's perceiving true things, which may not be real, but may still be true. It's just a really meaty thing to play with and to explore. And it took me to some places for myself as a writer that I hadn't touched on ever, like in therapy or anything. It became therapy in a way.
I like when you have this idea of doubting your senses, what often ends up resulting in a lot of these books is you think that the horror is the ghost or the potential ghost or the weird sounds or the problems with the house. And the actual horror is something that is very much rooted in reality. And that is, this whole doubting of your senses is partly forcing the protagonists to accept, hey, portions of humanity really suck. Really suck. This is the murder. This is the, we let the woman just sink right down into the quicksand and we didn't do anything about it, but that's because she let 5 children sink right down into the quicksand and not do anything about it. And yes, I just massively spoiled the end of a Victoria Holt novel. But that's the actual horror, not the ghosts, not the clanging. And one thing that I find fascinating is how much you can use this let's doubt our senses to really explore some of those very real truths about cruelty, about recently more what I'm seeing in some of the newer contemporary books about exploitation. Really focus. This is, I think, something that has come up much more in the Gothics that have been written in the last few years is, hey, it's not just the protagonist that is being exploited. There are a number of other people being exploited. Let's take a look at that. Issues of self-worth, issues of sometimes body horror. We didn't really get into the very often rather ableist things that we typically have seen in Gothic fiction, but they're absolutely there. Issues like that. So I think really that trusting your senses is much more of a working towards self-discovery, working towards world discovery, and also moving towards logic. These protagonists typically arrive in a place that does not make sense. Why do you have this rule that you can't go up into the left tower, or that, so-and-so is a maid, but, we never talk to her or whatever. And you have to find out the rationale. And in most of the books, there is a rationale. I'm always fascinated by the ones that there isn't. Those are cool in their own way. But that really becomes that whole trusting the senses.
So a book I just thought of, which not only messes with the character's senses as he's going through the notes, but the reader's senses as they're reading it, is House of Leaves. So when you're reading it, it's basically an entire experience, because you have to turn the book around and you have to do this and everything. It is a house that messes with people's perceptions, because it in terms has its own power. So, but that in a way is not, you don't know what's going on with the narrator as well as the house and everything, but it's a book that gets talked about by a lot of particular people, but that in terms in itself is kind of a Gothic book that you can bring up in this panel, but then again is its own experience in reading it. However, when talking about messing with perception as a person who has to question their own reality every day, you have to avoid certain ableist tropes in terms of mental illness, and particularly psychosis mental illness, because it has been maligned for years, particularly in, spoiler alert, Crimson Peak, where it was a wonderful Gothic film, but the ending is ableist garbage. And I'm just gonna leave it at that. If you want a wonderful Guillermo del Toro film, which is not ableist garbage, Pan's Labyrinth is the way to go. And it's also a Gothic film, and it's wonderful, and perception is reality the entire way through. And I'm done.
So we are coming in on the very end of this panel. At least some of us will be hanging out in the Discord at Scioto Room Odd. Before we go, does everyone want to say where people can find you on the internet aside from Discord?
I'm on Twitter, Jeanette_.
I'm also on Twitter, Mari, MARI_NESS.
I'm on Twitter at JS Corella, whatever.
And I'm on Twitter at CSEE_Starling. It's a terrible pun. And yep, you can hopefully we'll be around to answer any other questions you've got. Thanks everyone for coming and do this panel. Time to go back into our spooky homes.
Thank you, everyone.
It's 3 a.m. here. I need to sleep.
You need to sleep. Please sleep.